is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this program. On today's program, we're continuing with our new series entitled The Apportionment Black Belt, and this is session 3 in our ongoing series. So before we get into today's discussion, let's just briefly touch upon the topics that we've addressed so far. In session 1 of this program, we talked about the historic evolution of our apportionment laws as we now have them. And specifically, I'm talking about Labor Codes 4663 and 4664 and how apportionment was radically changed in 2004 with the passage of Senate Bill 899. Senate Bill 899 did a couple of things. It rewrote existing Labor Code 4663, it wrote new Labor Code 4664, and it repealed former Labor Code 4750, which was our guiding instruction code to deal with apportionment before the passage of Senate Bill 899. So Senate Bill 899 left us with Labor Codes 4663 and 4664, which are our instruction manual now for how we handle apportionment for claims with all dates of injury. All dates of injury. It's important that you realize that these apportionment laws now apply to all dates of injury. And I'm going to share with you today a couple of cases that have dates of injury prior to 2004 and prior to the passage of Senate Bill 899. But these apportionment laws were applied to those cases to establish precedent and case law precedent for principles and procedures involving apportionment from that point forward. And I'll share with you a few cases that illustrate that as a principle. And then in session 2 of our program, we talked about how to handle those examinees and how to handle the apportionment of permanent impairment in those examinees who have a prior industrial injury which settled by way of compromise and release. It's interesting because the new Labor Codes 4663 and 4664 are very concerned that we as qualified medical evaluators are concerned that we address prior industrial injuries when it comes time to consider our apportionment determination. And both of those codes, 4663 and 4664, both reference prior industrial injuries. Isn't that interesting? They don't reference prior automobile injuries. They don't reference prior slip and fall injuries. They don't reference prior sports injuries. And all of those types of injuries can contribute to the apportionment of the permanent impairment, but those aren't specifically listed in the codes. The codes specifically reference prior industrial injuries, and so that gives us some insight into the intent of the legislators at the time who were writing these new laws. The legislators were specifically concerned that we address prior industrial injuries in our apportionment determination. Because remember, the change in the apportionment laws came about as a result of Senate Bill 899, whose emergency and urgent purpose was to address the skyrocketing costs of administering workers' compensation claims. And the new laws are specifically concerned that employers only be legally and financially liable to pay one time for impairments to the same or similar body parts. In other words, these new apportionment laws are largely created in order to prevent duplication and multiplication of payments for same or similar impairments, and specifically for impairments that are due to prior industrial injuries. So in session 2, we talked about how to handle an examinee who has had a prior industrial injury when that industrial injury settled by way of compromise and release. And this represents the great preponderance of cases. Greater than 50% of cases do indeed settle by way of compromise and release. Well, today what I want to talk to you about is the other portion of the claims that settle by way of stipulation and award. And I want to discuss with you today The other possible outcome and the other possible scenario that you'll be faced in an examinee who has had a prior industrial injury, and that is the examinee who had a prior industrial injury that settled by way of stipulation and award. So we're going to be talking about examinees who have a prior award of permanent disability, and we'll talk about how to handle the apportionment and what are some of the considerations and what are some of the factors that are going to go into your thinking when it comes time for you to provide your approximate percentages of permanent impairment due to the industrial injury and your approximate percentages of the permanent impairment due to what we refer to as other factors. So today I want to review with you Labor Code Section 4664. I want to talk to you about several cases that have established precedents for how apportionment is handled in these types of situations. And this is going to be very informative for you because I guarantee that within your next 5 examinees, I'm sure, within your very next 5 examinees, you're going to encounter an examinee who has had a prior award of permanent disability. And isn't it true that in this work that we do, we frequently encounter examinees who have had a history of prior industrial injuries? Sometimes just a singular industrial injury, sometimes 2 industrial injuries. I just reviewed a case where the examinee had 7 prior industrial injuries, and those 7 prior cases settled all across the spectrum from compromise and release to stipulation and award to no impairment and no permanent disability rating. In other words, she was all over the board with no fewer than 7 prior industrial injuries, all of which came into the apportionment consideration when it came time to handle the apportionment. So we see these people that have multiple prior industrial injuries. And we're going to talk today specifically how to handle those who have settled their case in the past with a prior award of permanent disability. Okay? So you're going to see this in your very next 5 cases, and you'll be equipped and ready to handle the apportionment determination when that time comes. So let's take a quick break right here. I'm going to go ahead and assemble my references for today's discussion. I've included all of the references for you as well. You can download those by clicking the appropriate link in today's blog, and go ahead and print those out and bring them back with you. I think it's important that you have those cases right in front of you so that when we go over certain passages in each case, you can look at those passages with your own eyes. So I look forward to being back with you here in just a couple minutes as we continue our discussion on the apportionment black belt. And today we're specifically considering how to handle the apportionment in those examinees who have had a prior award of permanent disability. With you now and have my references for today's program. I hope you have those as well. Our references for today's program include the Copping case, Kopping, the Minvili case, the Carreras case, and the Papish case. We may or may not have time to get through all of those, but I hope that we will. And let's begin our discussion by just reminding ourselves that we're talking about how to handle apportionment in an examinee who we've now examined as the qualified medical evaluator, and we feel that the examinee has some level of permanent impairment due to a recent industrial injury. And we've been told that the examinee has had a prior industrial injury prior to the current injury. And the prior industrial injury settled with a stipulation and award and this examinee actually has a prior award of permanent disability of a certain percentage. Well, we now have done our examination and we find that the examinee does indeed have some permanent impairment. Okay, he has some permanent impairment. On exam, he has some objective findings. He describes limitations and activities of daily living. We believe that the condition is bona fide and that it qualifies for permanent impairment. Okay, so that's all fine and good. And when it comes time to do our apportionment determination, how do we determine how much of this impairment that the examinee has today, as a result of the examination that we did today, how do we determine how much of that impairment is due to the new industrial injury, and how much of that impairment is due to other factors, including the prior industrial injury, which was awarded a permanent disability rating? Okay? Well, the first consideration that we need to have in our mind is that when an examinee has a prior award of permanent disability, what does the word permanent mean? What does permanent mean? Permanent means that that disability is permanent. It's not temporary. It's not something that goes away. Permanent disability is permanent. And the legislators and the legislature was very concerned that we realized that permanent disabilities are permanent. In fact, they were so concerned that they wrote a law, 4664, to emphasize this fact to us. So let's review 4664 just to cement this concept of permanency in our minds. Okay? 4664 says, this is 4664B, it says if the applicant has received a prior award of permanent disability, it shall be conclusively presumed that the prior permanent disability exists at the time of any subsequent industrial injury. That's the first sentence. The second sentence says, this presumption is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. So 4664B has two sentences, and we're going to dissect each of these individually. Let's talk about the first one. It says, if they've received a prior award of permanent disability, it shall be conclusively presumed. Conclusively presumed. It's a conclusive presumption that the permanent disability is indeed permanent and it exists at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. So at the time of the subsequent industrial injury, according to the law, at least according to the law, the examinee at the time of the subsequent industrial injury was damaged goods. They had a permanent disability rating of a certain percentage for either the lumbar spine, the shoulder, the cervical spine, whatever, doesn't matter. They were already damaged goods. They were already damaged goods to the degree of the percentage of the permanent impairment rating. Okay, and we're going to dissect that, or the permanent disability rating. We're going to dissect that even more in just a couple minutes. So they were already damaged goods. Now, this is a new twist to Labor Code 4664 in our new apportionment laws, because it used to be that an examinee could claim a medical rehabilitation from the prior injury. They could get a permanent disability award, collect their benefits, cash their check, spend the money, and then claim that they had been medically rehabilitated and that their condition had returned to pre-injury, pre-condition status. In other words, that they were fine. They could argue for a fine condition known as a medical rehabilitation. Well, 4664 abolished that because every examinee in the world was claiming medical rehabilitation. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you claim that, oh my God, right prior to this subsequent industrial injury, before this happened, I was perfect. I was perfect. And all of this new impairment has nothing to do with my past history. Nothing to do with my prior industrial injury. Nothing to do with my career as a parachute jumpist. Nothing to do as a stuntman with the circus. Because before the subsequent industrial injury, I was medically rehabilitated, and I was perfect. Labor Code 4664, which was passed in an effort to control skyrocketing costs, changed this. It eliminated the opportunity for an examinee to claim a medical rehabilitation, and it requires us as evaluators to apportion out the prior permanent disability from the new disability, leaving the employer only with the difference between the two, and not making the employer responsible for the entirety of the disability now, because some of it already existed according to the law. And this is how 4664 addresses skyrocketing costs. It doesn't make employers pay again for the portion of the disability that has already been compensated due to the prior industrial injury. Makes sense? Makes sense. So the employer is only responsible for the new impairment, the new worsening above and beyond an already bad condition, an already damaged container. Okay, the examinee was already damaged goods. It's important to remember that, and we're going to explore the damaged goods in just a couple minutes. Now, the second sentence in Labor Code 4664 is quite confusing, and for many, many years, judges and the appeals board and everybody was confused as to what the second sentence meant, but it's now been established by case law, and it's actually very fascinating. And I want to share this with you because it's probably something that you don't know. I say that because I didn't know it. I handled some of these cases completely wrong. But the law is quite clear, and now we have case law that tells us and clarifies these two sentences and harmonizes these two sentences perfectly. Okay? The second sentence says that this presumption is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. So what presumption? Well, we said it's a conclusive presumption that the prior disability exists. Okay? And second sentence says that this presumption that the prior disability exists is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. So what does that mean? I used to take that to mean that this presumption is rebuttable. In other words, the existence of the prior permanent disability can be rebutted if the examinee can show substantial evidence that indeed they had medically rehabilitated themselves. What if you had an examinee that came to you and said, I was totally rehabilitated. After my injury, I started going to the gym, I lost 40 pounds, I cleaned up my diet, I work on my core exercises daily, I see a chiropractor twice a month for maintenance treatments on my back so I don't get into any trouble. And in the past 10 years, I haven't been to any doctors, any chiropractors, any practitioners whatsoever for my back. My back was perfect before the subsequent industrial injury. And if you reviewed the examinee's medical records and saw that indeed he'd been to the doctor for other conditions, but nowhere is there any mention of treatment for lower back, you could conclude that the examinee had indeed medically rehabilitated himself, and you could rebut the presumption, the conclusive presumption of the existence of the prior permanent disability. See, we only have two kinds of presumptions, conclusive presumptions and rebuttable presumptions. Well, the first sentence says that the presumption is conclusive. It means it cannot be argued, it cannot be rebutted. Second sentence says this presumption is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. That suggests that the presumption is rebuttable. Okay? That's the way I used to interpret this law, and that's the way many others did as well. But it was the copying case, and I have the copying case right here, that told us how we are to interpret the second sentence and how we harmonize what seems to be contradictory in the second sentence with the first sentence. Okay? So let me just get to the chase for you and tell you about the copying case. The copying case involved a highway patrolman who had a prior industrial injury that resulted in a permanent disability rating for the lumbar spine. He had a subsequent industrial injury that resulted in permanent impairment, again for the lumbar spine. And the second industrial injury was required to be apportioned under the new laws. In other words, the apportionment determination and the permanent impairment evaluation came after 2004. So the evaluator was required to apportion the new impairment by supposedly taking out or subtracting the prior permanent disability, because 4664 says that if he received a prior award of permanent disability, that prior award existed at the time of the subsequent industrial injury, and when the examinee reaches permanent stationary status and is found to have permanent impairment, the prior disability needs to be subtracted from the current disability to leave the employer only with the amount that they're liable for. So, first of all, Copping argued that he had medically rehabilitated himself. Okay, that's the first thing he said. And in arguing the medical rehabilitation, the workers' comp judge came back and said, no, you no longer have the opportunity to argue a medical rehabilitation. But Copping pointed to the second sentence in the code, which says, this presumption is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. In other words, Copping tried to rebut the conclusive presumption along the lines of what I said that I used to do as well. But the court came back and they said no. What that second sentence means, it does not mean that the presumption is rebuttable, and that even though the law says that the prior permanent disability conclusively exists, does not mean that you can rebut that, because the conclusive presumption is conclusive. It cannot be argued. Let me emphasize that. It cannot be argued. Examinees cannot argue for a medical rehabilitation. Those examinees who've received a prior award of permanent disability have that disability. It exists. It persists. It's the law. The Copping case sealed the deal in telling us that it's a conclusive presumption that cannot be rebutted. Now, what the second sentence means, where it says this presumption is a presumption affecting the burden of proof, what that means is that the burden of proof is on the defendant, number one, to prove the existence of a prior award of permanent disability, okay? So it's up to them to come to us as evaluators and notify us, hey, this guy had a prior disability for 14% in 1999. Please consider that when it comes time to provide your apportionment determination. So the burden of proof is on the defendant. It's on the employer. It's on the insurance company to prove the existence of a prior award of permanent disability. Once that's established, then the burden is also on the defendant to prove something else. And that is, the burden is on the defendant to prove that the prior permanent disability and the new permanent disability have some overlap. Either have some overlap, they have complete overlap, they have partial overlap, but that there's overlap between the prior disability and the current disability, and the overlap, it's the overlap that can be apportioned out, leaving the employer only with the portion of the permanent disability that's a direct result of their industrial injury. Okay? So let's define overlap. Overlap. What is overlap? Well, overlap is when two or more injuries or conditions cause some or all of the same disability. So we have an examinee that has some disability, and how much of that disability is due to the first injury? How much is due to the second injury? Where do these two injuries overlap and cause same or similar disability? Okay? So let's talk about overlap. Say we have an examinee who has 10% permanent disability from a year 2000 industrial injury, and then they have 15% permanent disability from a 2010 injury also to the same body part, let's say the lumbar spine. Where is the overlap? Where can we find overlap? Where do we look for overlap? Well, let's talk about that. Well, the law says that the prior permanent disability exists at the time of the subsequent injury. What is it about the prior disability? Let me ask you, what components of the prior disability are those that exist? What parts of it, what about it exists? Well, the answer to that is that every part of it, every part of it persists and exists into perpetuity. So what does that include? Number one, of course, is the percentage of permanent disability. And all the parties are going to be concerned that we properly subtract the appropriate percentage from the current impairment, because that relates specifically to dollars and benefits paid. Okay, so the percentage. What else? Well, let me ask you, what about the pain? What about the pain that the examinee reported with the prior industrial injury? When that examinee went to the qualified medical evaluator and told them about their current condition, and they reported pain, ongoing pain, terrible severe pain, the pain exists and persists and was present at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. So when the examinee comes to you at your qualified medical evaluation and reports pain, how do you handle that? You know, according to the law, that they already had pain. They already were damaged goods. They already had a bad back. They already had pain. The new injury is only responsible for the worsening pain, not for the whole pain. What if the examinee says to you, well, before this injury I had no pain? In that event, the examinee is arguing a medical rehabilitation, which Labor Code 4664 specifically tells us they cannot do. What about limitations and activities of daily living? If an examinee goes to the qualified medical evaluation and describes limitations and activities of daily living, and then based upon that gets a permanent disability award, then you can assume that those limitations and activities of daily living persisted and existed at the time of any subsequent injury. So when they come to your evaluation and they talk about limitations to activities of daily living, don't be surprised. They already had those. Those already existed and persisted. You're only concerned with the worsening inactivities of daily living, the further deterioration as a result of the subsequent injury. The employer is only responsible for the worsening of a person who already was struggling. That's the law, what the law says. Now, I have a note here about limitations and activities of daily living. If the examinee received an Alvarez-Guzman type rating, then the limitations to activities of daily living could already be contained within the definition of their rating. So for example, some examinees will receive a permanent impairment rating by analogy to limitations with a lifting. Limitations in lifting. We provide for permanent impairment in these examinees under Chapter 6 by analogy to hernia. So these are people who specifically have losses in their ability for lifting. So if an examinee has a 2000 industrial injury with preclusions from very heavy work and repetitive heavy lifting, and now they have a 2010 injury with impairment by analogy to hernia due to loss of capacity with lifting, we know that they already had limitations with lifting. We can consider the new limitations with lifting and simply apportion out that which was already present. And I have a case with you exactly along those lines. I'll share with you in just a couple minutes. Gait derangement. Gait derangement. Sometimes examinees will get a permanent impairment due to gait derangement or due to difficulty with weight-bearing activities such as standing, walking, and so the loss of activities of daily living is contained within the definition of the impairment. So that would be something that you would want to explore in comparing the new impairment with the prior impairment. Okay? Well, what else about the prior permanent disability exists at the time of any subsequent industrial injury? How about the permanent impairment rating? The formulation and the definition of the prior permanent impairment rating persists and exists. If the examinee had a prior permanent impairment due to loss of function of the lumbar spine under the range of motion method, all of those findings, the range of motion findings, the neurologic findings, the specific spinal diagnosis finding, all of those components persist and exist at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. How about range of motion findings? If you had an examinee who on their prior industrial injury was demonstrating losses of range of motion, and they come to you to your evaluation with losses of range of motion, those losses of range of motion already existed and persisted according to the law. You're only concerned with the worsening or the new loss of range of motion. What about neurologic findings? Well, we could go down the list of all physical exam findings. Suffice it to say that all of the physical examination findings that went into the prior award of permanent disability, all of those positive objective findings, those persist and exist up until the time of the subsequent industrial injury, and exist and persist through the time of your examination of the examinee. You're only concerned with the worsening, okay? Don't be surprised when the examinee comes to you and tells you that they're in bad condition, because according to the law, we know that they were already in bad condition, that they already had problems, they already had limitations to activities of daily living, they already had losses of range of motion, they already had neurologic findings, they already had weaknesses to manual muscle testing, they already had those things. Don't be surprised. Your job is to not identify the limitations, it's to identify the worsening. And we apportion out all of the disability or impairment that was existing due to the prior award of industrial injury. Okay? So that's quite interesting. It's quite interesting as a concept, but it's not as easy as it sounds in practical matter to handle these apportionment determinations. And it does not mean to imply that every single time you have an examinee with a prior award of permanent disability, that you simply take their prior award of permanent disability and subtract the numeric percentage from your permanent impairment rating to come up with the new impairment. It would be great if it was that simple, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple because our job is to identify areas of overlap, and many times areas of overlap cannot be identified. And I'm going to share with you in our next segment several of those cases. And we'll talk about how to handle those difficult cases where overlap is difficult to establish, and how you can still provide some sort of a reasonable and substantial argument on the apportionment. So I look forward to being back with you in just a couple minutes, and we'll go into several new cases that tell us exactly how to do just that. So let's have a brief review here, and then we'll continue on with some very interesting cases that illustrate key points regarding the prior award of permanent disability. So it's interesting, many examinees have a prior industrial injury, and some of those come to us with an award of prior permanent disability. An official award with a percentage rating of permanent disability. Well, according to Labor Code 4664, that disability persists and exists. So you're dealing with an examinee that comes to you that was already damaged goods at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. And your job is now to handle the apportionment to provide a final disability rating for which the employer is ultimately responsible. And it's supposed to be accurate and trimmed down only to include the portion of the disability that's directly due to the injury. And the burden of proof of establishing this apportionment is on the defendant. Okay, it's the job of the doctor to provide the permanent impairment rating and the apportionment determination. But the burden is on the defendant to prove the existence of a prior award of permanent disability, and also to prove that the prior disability and the current disability have some overlap. Okay? So you will receive requests from the defendant asking for this discussion, to discuss the overlap and to apportion it appropriately. Now, overlap, excuse me, overlap is not always easy to establish. In fact, in some cases, it can be impossible to establish. In those cases where the defense believes that it's impossible to establish overlap, they'll let it go. They won't ask you to clarify your position on apportionment. They'll realize that there's no possible way to establish overlap, and that they're responsible for the entire rating of permanent disability, not subject to apportionment. In other words, the examinee gets the full rating unapportioned in those cases where overlap cannot be established. Sometimes overlap is easy to establish, sometimes it's impossible to establish. Let me give you an example. If you had an examinee who had a 2007 industrial injury to the cervical spine, and they were rated with a DRE cervical category 2 for 8%, and and then the examinee has a subsequent industrial injury, and you examine them and you consider their condition to be consistent with a DRE cervical category 2 for 8%. So we had a prior DRE, a current DRE, those exactly 100% overlap, and you can say that 100% of the permanent impairment is due to the prior condition and 0% is due to the current industrial injury. That's a case where overlap is easy to establish. But of course, we don't always get those types of cases. Well, one of the more difficult types of cases to establish overlap involves those cases that had a prior award of permanent disability that was rated under the 1997 Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, and those cases that were rated according to the AMA Guides, 5th edition, for a permanent impairment rating. These are entirely different systems. They're apples and oranges. They have a completely different set of considerations. And there have been some cases where the judge determined that no overlap could reasonably and substantially be established. And the examinee was then entitled to the entire award, not subject to apportionment. So I want to share with you a couple of those cases. Okay, the first one, and I have this for you, is the Minivieli case. Minivieli was a firefighter who had a prior award of permanent disability based on the 1997 Permanent Disability Rating Schedule for a 1992 injury, okay, old injury. And he had a new impairment award for a 2004 injury rated under the AMA Guides. Now, the judge determined that these two disability rating schedules were completely different standards, and that the examinee's impairment or disability in either case from the 92 injury and the 2004 injury could not be redefined in terms of the other schedule. In other words, for the 1992 injury, the agreed medical evaluator looked at the injury with a frame of reference using our current impairment rating system, and he said, I can't do it. He looked at the 2004 injury from the perspective of the 1997 permanent disability rating schedule, and he said, I can't do it. These are two completely different standards. They're apples and oranges. They cannot be compared. And so no overlap between the current disability and the prior disability could be established, and the examinee, which was Minnie-Villy, received the entirety of the disability unapportioned. So what is it? What are some of the things that are different about the prior permanent disability rating schedule and our current disability rating schedule using the AMA guides? Well, number one, the 1997 permanent disability rating schedule, you remember, was based on a loss of ability to compete in the open labor market. Okay, what's our current disability rating schedule based on? It's based on a loss of future earning capacity. Completely different standards. Okay, so that's one component that makes an apples to oranges comparison not possible. Number two is the physical examination requirements for an AMA guides rating may be different than the requirements for a permanent disability rating schedule, 1997 permanent disability rating schedule type rating. And I did a little bit of research on this, and I looked up the physical examination requirements for the shoulder using the old system where we referred to Packard-Thurber textbook for measurements and the AMA guides. And it's interesting, the AMA guides describe range of motion testing for the shoulder that involves 6 motions. Packard-Thurber describes range of motion testing for the shoulder using only 5 motions. Packard-Thurber did not consider shoulder adduction, AD deduction, whereas the AMA guides considers shoulder adduction. Additionally, Packard-Thurber considers 170 degrees of shoulder flexion and shoulder abduction to be normal. The AMA guides use a figure of 180 degrees. So the physical examination procedures and the physical examination requirements are completely different. And so some parties argue, and there is case law to support this, including the Minnie-Villy case, that apples and oranges cases cannot be apportioned because they define the permanent impairment or the permanent disability using completely different standards. Now, I do have an example where we have the same scenario, and the agreed medical evaluator was able to consider components of the different standards and come up with some overlap that was able to be successfully apportioned out. That's the Papish case. We'll get to that one in just a minute. Next one is the Carreras case. Carreras was a police officer who suffered prior permanent disability rating of 20% due to high blood pressure. Well, he suffered a new industrial injury resulting in permanent disability to the heart, to the bilateral knees, and due to hypertensive heart disease. Okay, and in this case, in the Carreras case, the defendant made no attempt to prove overlap. In other words, they just threw in the towel because of the different standards that were employed in relation to the first injury compared to the standards that were employed in relation to the second injury. So the burden of proof is on the defendant. If the defendant makes no motion, no request from you as the evaluator to come up with an apportionment determination, then the examinee, in this case was Carreras, will get the entirety of the ward unapportioned, not chiseled away, not whittled away. They get the entirety of the permanent disability rating. That was Carreras. And then let's talk about Papish, and then we'll have some concluding remarks. Papish was a truck driver who sustained injury to the lumbar spine with a 34% permanent impairment rating. This was for a new industrial injury. This is the subsequent injury. Had a 34% permanent impairment rating. When this was adjusted for age and occupation, this amounted to a 54% permanent disability. Okay? And the disability was due to, number one, limitations on lifting. In other words, by analogy to hernia in Chapter 6, for that he received 19% permanent impairment. And also gait derangement. Gait derangement, for which he received 19% permanent impairment. So limitations on lifting, gait derangement, 19 and 19. Using the combined values chart, this combined to 34% permanent impairment. When adjusted for age and occupation, resulted in 54% permanent disability. Okay? Well, it was found that he had a year 2000 industrial injury, wherein the permanent disability was 22%. So he had a prior award of permanent disability of 22%. The current permanent disability is 54%. Now, the prior award of permanent disability was based upon a 30 to 33% loss of lifting capacity. That was what went into the permanent disability formulation, loss of pre-injury capacity for lifting. That resulted in 22% permanent disability. So we have a prior permanent disability due to loss of lifting capacity. We have a new permanent disability due to gait derangement and loss of lifting capacity. And so what happened was the agreed medical evaluator apportioned out the 22% from the 54. In other words, they apportioned 60% of the permanent impairment due to the prior award of permanent disability. Well, the judge looked at this and the applicant requested a reconsideration by claiming that the apportionment should be limited only to the portion of the permanent impairment relating to the lifting capacity, because it's the lifting capacity where the new impairment and the prior impairment overlap. This part down here, this non-overlapping part, that's the part of the permanent disability due to gait derangement. So it was found that only the portion of the impairment related to lifting capacity was overlapped, and only that portion was subject to apportionment. And it's interesting because even though they used different standards, the first one was according to the 1997 Permanent Disability Rating Schedule, the second one was according to the AMA guides, totally different standards as we've established here, but the evaluator in this case was able to find some common overlap between the two systems, and the common overlap involved capacity for lifting. So the ultimate disposition of the case was that the AME apportioned 60% of the impairment for loss of lifting to the 2000 industrial injury, but there was no apportionment for the impairment due to gait derangement, because that was an entirely new permanent impairment. That represented a large portion of the worsening of Mr. Papish's condition as a result of the second industrial injury. So doctors, let's conclude this with some summary remarks. And that is that, according to the law, a prior award of permanent disability exists and persists forever. It's conclusively presumed. There's no way around it. It's the law. It's the truth. It's the way it is. It's the way you need to consider and look at your examinee. Any deviation from this perspective considers a medical rehabilitation which is prevented according to the law. Okay? So the examinee already had pain. He already had limitations to activities of daily living. He already had positive objective findings. He already had significant findings on diagnostic studies. He was already damaged goods at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. Okay? It exists. However, and here's the ray of hope for the examinee, that prior disability is only subject to apportionment when you demonstrate overlap. When you demonstrate that the prior disability and the current disability have some things in common, that there's overlap, that they're the same, When there's overlap, the overlap gets subtracted out, leaving the employer only responsible for that portion of the disability that's new, that's a result of their industrial injury. So your job is to seek the overlap. Ask the examinee, I know you have pain. I know you have loss of range of motion. I know you're weak. You already had that. But tell me, what about your current condition is worse? What's worse? How is the pain worse? How are the limitations and activities of daily living worse? How is your range of motion worse? You already had bad range of motion. How is it worse? Tell me about the worsening. If the examinee is vague and a poor historian about the worsening, perhaps there is no worsening, and all of the current permanent impairment or disability is due to the prior industrial injury, and 0% is due to the current industrial injury. If they're vague and can't define and describe the worsening, perhaps there's no worsening. The employer is only responsible for the worsening. Interesting scenario. So probe for the worsening, because we already knew and already know that they were bad at the time of the subsequent industrial injury. So doctors, I hope this helps you. There are no instruction manuals as to how to handle apportionment. It seems like we have to learn these things as we go. And when important case laws like these come around, it really clears up a lot of confusion and gives us great instruction as to how to proceed with our own apportionment determinations. As I said in our last video, with regards to compromise and release, I used to handle those all wrong. And with regards to prior awards of permanent disability, I used to handle those all wrong as well. So these important case laws come out and are published and are very instructive as to how the courts want to see these apportionment determinations handled. So doctors, I hope this helps you. And I want to thank you today for joining me on today's video. Look forward to being with you on future videos. And for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter, wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.